welcome to the Personal History Hub. So today we're going to be having a look at the how far do you agree with interpretation, whatever they give you, about a topic, whatever the topic is about. Now this is worth 16 marks, this question. It's the biggest question on paper 3, so it's the last one on paper 3, and it's question 3D. So it's part of that series, it's the last one in that series of linked questions that are all based around the same two interpretations and the same two sources. So this is going to be the last one that I'm going to put in the playlist for these paper 3 questions. So if you've not seen, I would stop this video and go back to the 2 4 mark ones first. If you haven't seen them, I'd watch them first before you start having a go at this 16 marker, because this will make much more sense to you once you've attempted those first two. Okay. So let's have a look at an example. So I'm going to use the same example, the same interpretations that we've been having a look at in the last 2 videos. So it's how far do you agree with interpretation 1 about the causes of the riots in US cities in the 1960s? Explain your answer using both interpretations and your knowledge of the historical context. So this is the one where we have to start using our own knowledge now, not just the two interpretations. So let's have a quick look at the bottom of the mark scheme before I share the top tips with you. So it says answer provides an explained evaluation. So because you're being asked to evaluate, you're going to have to come to a conclusion as well, because it's how far do you agree this time. It's not just explain. We're being asked our opinion on this. Offering an alternative view from the interpretation. So that means that we're not just to use the one in the question. So even though it says how far do you agree with interpretation 1, the fact it says we have to offer an alternative view from the interpretation means we have to use both of them. So we have to present a balanced argument, both sides of the argument, what's one saying, what's two saying, what knowledge backs that up, and then come to our conclusion as to which one we agree with more. Right, the mark scheme does say as well, you use this in coming to a well-reasoned judgment. Okay, so precise analysis of the interpretations is shown, indicating how the differences of views are showed and using this to reach a judgment. Relevant contextual knowledge is precisely used to support the evaluation, so we must use our own knowledge. Your judgment is well argued and supported. Your argument is sustained and logical. And then for this one as well, there's an additional, so it's out of 16 marks, but in the exam there'll be an additional 4 marks added onto that for SPAG as well, so spelling, punctuation and grammar. But that's not just your spellings and punctuation, it's your correct use of historical language as well. Okay, so you've got to be using specialist terminology in the correct way and keywords. Okay, so keywords and people is wide ranging, and that you're showing that you understand how they fit into the context. Okay, so just bear that in mind, that there's an extra 4 marks on this one for SPAG. So let's just share some top tips. You must mention both interpretations. So I've already said that. I'm not going to spend that much time talking about that, but you must mention both of the interpretations. So a big common downfall on this question is that students just read the how far do you agree with interpretation 1, 2, okay, whichever one they give you, and they only talk about that one. Okay, and then you can't really get many more than half marks for that. Okay, it's very difficult to give you above half marks for that. You don't need to mention the sources this time. If you want to use them as a kind of springboard for your knowledge, so if you want to reread the sources and think this might prompt my own knowledge, that's fine, or use it as part of the own knowledge section. You can do that if you want to, but you don't necessarily need to use the sources. So for the last question, the 3C, we use the sources to say why the interpretation's different, but we don't need to use them this time. And we must use our own knowledge. So unlike the last 2 questions where we were told not to use our own knowledge, we must use our own knowledge in this one. It literally says it in the question, using your knowledge of the historical context. You must come to a conclusion. Like I said, it's not just an explain question, it's a how far do you agree? Okay, so it's asking you for your opinion. Spend around 20 minutes on this question, no more. Okay, I would spend just 20 minutes on it. So let's have a look at the interpretations in more detail. We should be fairly familiar with these interpretations now because we've had a look at them on the last 2 questions. So I'm not going to spend time rereading them. If you want to pause and reread them now yourself, that's fine, you do that. But I'm not going to read them with you because we have read them on the last 2 questions. Okay, you should be watching this as the 3rd in a sequence. So just a little checklist that I've put at the bottom there. This is how you can think about this question. So begin with the interpretation that's in the question. For us, that's interpretation one. Okay, so we'll start with one first, tackle one completely, then tackle two, then conclude. So what we need to do with interpretation one is we need to make an inference about it. So directly link it to the question, what is it saying about the causes of the riots? Okay, once we've done that, which we've already done really in 3B, so again, we can use some of what we've already done. We should be familiar with them by the time we've done those 2 4 markers. Then we need to make, once we've made our 2 inferences, sorry, we need to add the 2 quotes that back up our inferences. Okay, so again, we're just quoting from the interpretation. So this top bit here should be fairly straightforward to do because you've already done it for the last 2 questions. Okay, you've already kind of paraphrased it, made inferences, and backed that up with quotes from the interpretation. Okay, then this is a new bit that we have to do. We need to find 2 pieces of detailed own knowledge to back up the inferences and quotes. So this is where you need to know your stuff. You need to have done your revision. Okay, so if you want to go and if you want to pause the video, get your booklet out for paper 3, the second part of paper 3 booklet, that's fine. You can do that. Once you've done that for interpretation one, you then need to repeat for the other interpretation, as you must show a balanced argument before coming to your conclusion. And then finally come to your conclusion. So we'll do it together. Okay, we'll really break it down. So I will do interpretation one with you, as we've done on previous examples, and you can have a go at interpretation two using the writing structure that I will put up on the screen for you. So start with the interpretation that is in the question. So in this case, it's interpretation one. So make some inferences about what it's telling you about the causes of the riots, and quote it, back this up. So literally just think, what is this interpretation telling me? I need to get that across to the examiner. Then I need to quote it to show the examiner that I have actually read these interpretations, that I've not just plucked this out of thin air. Okay, so we'll say interpretation one's view is that the causes of the riots in the 1960s due to the lack of action as a result of the civil rights movement at the time, the anger and frustration felt by urban black people. This view is then developed further by suggesting that black people had lost patience with Martin Luther King's non-violent approach, which some black people felt was used to win white support. The interpretation states they did not want to seek white support, suggesting that some black people had lost faith in Martin Luther King's approach, causing frustrations. Okay, so that's kind of what we've already done in the first one of these on those 4 markers. So again, use what you've already done. We've already made inferences about it. We've already quoted it. Transfer that over. Okay, you're in a timed condition. Use what you've already done. So that bit should be fairly straightforward because we're simply just using the interpretation. This is the bit that's going to require a little bit more thinking from you, some own knowledge this time, something we've not done on the past 2 questions. Finish your section on interpretation one, you need to come up with at least 2 detailed pieces of own knowledge that directly link the quotes you have picked out of the question. So we want to be talking about why people were angry and frustrated with King, why they didn't feel like the civil rights movement was getting anywhere. Okay, because that's what we talked about. Those are the things that we've picked out of the interpretation. So a really common downfall on this question is students just throwing in everything they know, all their own knowledge on the riots, because that's what they've revised and they want to get it all across to the examiner. Don't do that. Make sure it's really focused and really linked to the question. Remember what we read on that top band of the mark scheme. It's got to have a line of reasoning. Okay, it's got to be well organised answers. So don't just throw in any old own knowledge that you can pluck out of anywhere about the Watts riots. Make sure it's linked to what you've said about interpretation one. So I've said I somewhat agree with interpretation one's view because I know by the early 1960s some black people were becoming very frustrated with King's non-violent approach. For instance, Malcolm X was very vocal at this time about his hatred and rejection of the non-violent approach. He said that many black people were now starting to think that non-violent direct action was not working. Malcolm X criticised civil rights leaders such as King for trying to work with white people to gain equality. He believed that white Americans would always see black people as second-class citizens, so trying to work with them was futile. He urged for black power, stating that more direct action was needed. Malcolm X and the Black Power movement became very popular at this time because many black people agreed with these sentiments. Despite all of the civil rights bills that had been passed by the early 1960s, real change had yet to be fully implemented, leading to frustration for many black people. This frustration would ultimately erupt into violent riots by 1964. Okay, so I've talked directly about why people were frustrated with King. I've Malcolm X because he was one of the key people that called out things trying to work with white people. Okay, so I'm using my own knowledge this time. So that kind of finishes off our bit on interpretation 1. So the next thing you need to do is have a go at doing interpretation 2 this time. So we've done a paragraph kind of summarising what interpretation 1 says with quotes. We've done a paragraph of own knowledge that backs up interpretation 1. Now you need to repeat that process for interpretation 2. So if you want to pause, use the writing structure. So the pink one is the first one. So you're going to say, however, on the other hand, I disagree with interpretation 2. Interpretation 1, as does interpretation 2. 2 argues that the cause of the riots was, so you need to make some inferences, paraphrase, quote from 2. Okay, then you need to come up with some own knowledge that backs up 2. So I also disagree with 1 because from my own knowledge, I know that there were many other causes of the riots. So I'd be talking about things like unemployment, how many black people were unemployed, why there was a problem with unemployment, why there was problems with housing, how people lived in ghettos, because that's all the stuff you're going to say about interpretation 2. So I will also leave interpretation 2 on the screen for you if you want to pause now, have a go at doing that on a piece of paper before I share the model answer with you. Okay, so this is a complete section on interpretation 2. Your own knowledge might be slightly different to mine. That's absolutely fine as long as it links to what you've said in the dark blue bit at the top. As long as it links to this bit where you've summarised interpretation 2, then it doesn't matter if your own knowledge is slightly different to mine. Okay, there's lots of different things that you can say. There's no right or wrong. So I've said, however, on the other hand, I disagree with interpretation 1, as does interpretation 2. Who disagrees with the suggestion that anger and frustration over King's approach had led to the riots? Instead, interpretation 2 suggests that riots were caused by issues of poverty amongst black people who were living in slums, who were often unemployed. The suggestion is that this poverty had been caused by a lack of implementation of civil rights laws in many states. The interpretation even goes as far to suggest that this led to the demand for black power, which might have been the catalyst to the riots. And then the red bit is the own knowledge section now. So I somewhat agree with this suggestion in interpretation 2, because I know that one of the main factors that caused the riots were the dire conditions in urban ghettos. It was no coincidence that many riots occurred in the summer in many cities. This is because summer was the time when the conditions were worse in the ghettos and the heat simply added to this. Not only that, black citizens living in these ghettos were twice as likely to be unemployed, and even if they were employed, they had low paid, unskilled jobs. Often this was a result of receiving poor quality education in the first place. Both of these factors meant that black people living in city ghettos were twice as likely to be poor. Landlords were white and crowded them into overpriced, poorly maintained housing. As interpretation 2 suggests, these factors could have been improved had civil rights laws been implemented properly. All of these factors combined led to riots in major cities in direct response to the dire conditions they were continuing to live in. So that's kind of similar to what you should have said for interpretation 2. So have a look at yours now compared to mine. See if there's anything else that you need to add. So to finish off this question, we must add a conclusion, as the question is asking us how far we agree with interpretation 1. You must, however, mention both the interpretations in the conclusion. So don't get carried away just talking about one, because we have presented a balanced argument and we have talked about both interpretations. Mention both in your conclusion. So I said, in conclusion, I partially agree with interpretation 1. It is without doubt that by the time of the first riots in 1964, some black people were becoming frustrated and disillusioned by the non-violent direct action espoused by King. Many black citizens were no longer wanting support of white people and instead had joined forces with Malcolm X and supported his insistence on black power. Having said this, I agree more firmly with interpretation 2. I think this because I believe that the dire conditions that black people were still experiencing in urban slums by 1964, despite the so-called civil rights laws that had been passed before this time, proved to be the salt in the wound. Black people living in poverty due to their continued poor education and subsequent low-paid jobs had simply had enough of these conditions by the early 1960s. It could be argued that the riots were ultimately caused by a combination of factors, some of which are mentioned in both interpretations. The move away from non-violent feelings of anger, mentioned in interpretation 1, were then harnessed by the new Black Power movement, mentioned in interpretation 2. who inspired these urban Black people to rise up. So in your conclusion, it's important to note you don't necessarily have to 100% agree with one or 100% agree or disagree with two. You can take a kind of middle ground as long as it's well argued and well reasoned and you've discussed both sides. So this is the full model answer. So if you want to pause it and read it all together to see how it flows, that's absolutely fine. So I will leave this one here, and then that's the rest of it. So if you want to pause the video to just read it all through to see how it all flows. Okay? And don't forget to subscribe to the Pre-Snow History Hub.